This pure theory is to put yourself in that position. Because Heidegger's work is a man in early life in full consciousness of radical mental gifts, thinking about what it means to die before you get there, and not responding at the level of emotion, although I believe personally that all theory is physically based and comes out of the emotions as part of one's physicality. But let's not intrude my ideas too much. Another section is Dasein's attestation of an authentic potentiality for being and resoluteness. Another section is Dasein's authentic potentiality for being a whole and temporality as the ontological meaning of a care. Then there's a section on temporality and everydayness. By this time we've got up to page 421, by the way. Then there's a section on temporality and historicality. And then there's a section on temporality and within timeness as the source of the ordinary conception of time. Then there's some dealings with other theorists who are rather sort of brushed away at the end, Hegel in particular. The last section of all, which is section 83, around pages 436 to 486, is the existential temporal analysis of Dasein and the question of fundamental ontology as to the meaning of being in general. This is the moment when he wants to place man before death, self-aware of the nature of authentic existence. As a critique of all of this sort of material, Adorno, in some respects his chief ideological nemesis on the other side, wrote a book called The Jargon of Authenticity, which is an attack upon this type of thinking. Adorno is one of the key thinkers in what's called Western Marxism and the Frankfurt School. Now, here is a section on death, because it's all essentially about death. Underlying this biological ontical exploration of death, that just means a biological exploration of death, is a problematic that is ontological, that concerns the science of being. We still have to ask how the ontological essence of death is defined in terms of that of life. In a certain way, this has always been decided already in the ontical investigation of death. Such investigations operate with preliminary concepts of life and death, which have been more or less clarified. That's in the last 290 pages, which I'll forbear from reading out. These preliminary conceptions need to be sketched out as the ontology of Dasein, which is being in being. Within the ontology of Dasein, which is superordinate to an ontology of life, the existential analysis of death is in turn subordinate to a characterization of Dasein's basic state. The ending of that, pardon, this is very, very difficult to read, even up here. The ending of that which lives we have called perishing. Dasein too has its death, of the kind appropriate to anything that lives. And basically, he's asking here, does what traditionalist orders have called the soul survive death? And it has, not in ontical isolation, but as co-determined by its primordial kind of being. Insofar as this is the case, Dasein too can end without authentically dying, though on the other hand, qua Dasein, it does not simply perish. We designate this intermediate phenomenon as its demise. And then there's a large footnote which I'll forbear from going into because it's printed in point 6, I think. Let the term dying stand for that way of being in which Dasein is towards its death. Auxiliary footnote. Accordingly, we must say that Dasein never perishes. Dasein, however, can demise only as long as it is dying. So he's talking about the death of the concept of the soul, which is self-aware of the possibility of that moment. Okay? Medical and biological investigation into demising can obtain results which may even become significant ontologically if the basic orientation for an existential interpretation of death has been made secure. Aha! Or must sickness and death in general, even from a medical point of view, notice medical point of view, physical stuff which we keep out of sight, be primarily conceived as existential phenomena. The first thing that strikes you about this is his attitude towards death. You walk around the death ward in a hospital, they're all about to give out. Most people's response is physical and emotional, the one on the other. He regards that as bourgeois deviation, even as filth. Always keep your theory before you, because that's how you apprise the nature of that which is real as against that which is mere appearance and that which is governed by dread. In the 1960s, the counterculture that had many tendencies which ultimately tended overwhelmingly to the left, regardless of this, had the notion that I've lost my thread now. In the 60s, there were many, many countercultural tendencies. But they had the notion that life was not as it should be or could be. That there needed to be a spiritual dimension to human beings that had been lost sight of given the collapse of the Christian religion. And I take it as unarguable that in our civilization in the last 100 years, in accordance with what it once was in the West, largely with the odd exception, individual and group, the Christian religion has collapsed. And it's collapsed amongst the most advanced thinkers of our civilization and racial or ethnic group from early in the 19th century. Or at least they were aware of the possibility of its mass collapse long before it became a sociological phenomenon. This is why this theory, which ultimately has had much more impact in theology than it has in philosophy, has been put in this particular way. Now, let's have... Now this book goes on for 460 pages. And when the Renaissance occurred in our thinking, one of the great criticism of the philosophical schools that preceded it, of which Duns Scotus was an accredited master, was that they were dealing with things that could never be proved at this level of reality, even theoretically. And the slogan that's used is that they were debating the number of angels that can dance on the head of a pin. And it was all utterly pointless. And we had to get away from all of that. Now, Heidegger wants to go back there up to a point. But in actual fact, he wants to go further back. He wants to go back to the pre-Socratics. He wants to go back to the Sophists. He wants to go back to the original and primary Greek thinkers that begin the process 2,500 years ago, which is why Nietzsche obsessed him. Because if you like, Nietzsche stands halfway between this radical essentialist stroke quasi-religious thinking, that there is before you nothing but God, and God in all, and God for all, and you're part of him, which is, if you sacralize this language, begins to make sense of what being is, what being in being is, what being in being before being is, and so on. It's, if you like, a rerouted theological language use. There's that position. And prior traditionalists who have right-wing views largely accord philosophically and psychologically with this area. Nietzsche, who's a figure who obsessed Heidegger, of course, and who has this enormous theoretical explosion at the end of the 19th century, just preceding the emergence of people like Husserl, Jaspers and Heidegger in early 20th century Germanic thinking at a high philosophical level. Don't forget, Anglo-American philosophy almost denies the possibility of metaphysics. Bertrand Russell would say, if he was sat at the back, which is a bit difficult considering he's been a corpse for about 30 years, but he would say it's all meaningless. It's an interesting talk, but it's about things that can't be proved at any level and is therefore pointless. Because your view is as good as his, as good as so-and-so's. The only difference is people can put it better or worse. But there can be no grounded truth that I can grasp and put social practice and purpose to. Now Nietzsche stands halfway between the left existentialist view, that there's nothing prior, that put very simply, we make it up as we go along. Baudrillard, a French intellectual, wrote a book in the 1990s saying that the first Gulf War was just a computer game. Didn't happen. Didn't happen. It was just a discourse. All those cluster bombs and stealth bombs and so on. It was just a fantasy of a televisual age. One man's discourse, you see. In an age of extreme relativism, which is the almost opposite of this absolutist theory, totalitarian theory, which is actually mentally what it is. We see the division between what exists now and the reasons for some of the very controversial, certainly in mainstream, political choices that Heidegger made in the middle of his life in Germany in the 30s. Now Nietzsche's position is that there is a prior, there is an essence, but Nietzsche is a partial to semi-absolute existential thinker. Because Nietzsche's contribution to modernity and to modern intellectual thinking is there may be things which are prior, but we don't know what they are. And we have to test them through struggle, through life, through will and purposiveness, and various levels of what he called will to power, which he believed was the basis of all lived existence. So Nietzsche says God is dead.